The year 1216 was a turbulent time for England. Throne disputes, land conflicts, and public unrest were felt in every corner of the kingdom. Amidst this chaos, King John II lived in splendor within his palace. Lavish feasts, luxurious chambers, and countless servants. On the surface, everything seemed perfect. Yet beneath it all, the king's health was under serious threat. In those days, the halls of the palace echoed not only with politics and power struggles. There was a quiet, unnoticed enemy moving silently: disease. And history would record that even a powerful king could succumb to this invisible foe. The first light of morning struck the stone walls of Newark Castle in England. Inside the palace, the silence was broken by a soft murmur, as if the halls were preparing for the day's activity. King John II's magnificent chamber was illuminated by sunlight filtering through heavy curtains. Gold-embellished objects and furniture adorned with precious stones displayed the king's wealth and power. In the palace corridors, servants hurriedly moved about, preparing breakfast trays and cleaning the grand halls. Seated on his throne, King John attended to maps and documents laid out before him by his advisors. Taxes, land agreements, and political matters with neighboring kingdoms completely filled his agenda. Yet beneath his usual determination and stern demeanor, there was a subtle unease. A mild discomfort stirred in his stomach, and a growing pressure in his bowels began to trouble him. The king dismissed it as a minor issue, for small ailments were commonplace in palace life. But as the hours passed, the pain intensified, becoming nearly unbearable. At first, the palace physicians brushed off his condition. "A slight discomfort. It will pass soon," they said. Yet the tension etched on the king's face and the onset of sweating made it clear that this was no trivial matter. Servants hovered anxiously around him, attempting to assist, but no remedy could alleviate the growing agony. King John rose from his throne and began pacing the room. Each step was accompanied by the sharp sting of abdominal pain, turning his walk into a struggle. As he moved from the grand hall into the corridors, he passed under the royal coats of arms and historical paintings, appearing like a fragile shadow against the grandeur of the palace. Those within the walls noticed the pain on the king's face, exchanging worried glances in silence. At that moment, one of the king's advisors quietly approached. "Your Majesty, perhaps you should rest," he suggested. But pride would not allow King John to yield. He had to appear strong and resolute. To show weakness could signal vulnerability to enemies who might threaten his throne. Yet the pain had taken control, defying his will. His face paled, his hands were damp with sweat, and his steps grew slower and more labored. The silence echoing through the palace corridors gradually gave way to anxious whispers. Servants, physicians, and advisors tried to gauge the severity of the king's illness, debating what measures should be taken. Everyone knew that what happened within these walls could affect not just one man, but the fate of the entire kingdom. A minor ailment in the king could swiftly escalate into a full-blown crisis. And so, on that day, within the splendor of a powerful king's palace, a silent and invisible enemy, disease, was at work. No one noticed it yet, but as the hours passed, King John's health became perilously entwined with the destiny of the realm. King John's ailment grew increasingly severe as the day progressed. What began in the morning as a mild stomachache and slight discomfort had by noon escalated into intense cramps and relentless unease. When the palace physicians arrived at the king's chamber, they immediately noticed the pain etched on his face, the pallor in his eyes, and the sweat glistening on his brow revealed that his condition could no longer be ignored. The chief physician approached the king and asked in a trembling voice, "Your Majesty, do you feel well?" Though King John tried to maintain a posture of strength and resolve, his hands shook involuntarily, his face had lost its color, and his breathing was uneven. Meanwhile, servants moved quietly around the bed, attending to every movement with careful attention. Some exchanged worried whispers, asking, "What will happen if the king does not recover?" A quiet fear began to ripple through the palace, like a shadow creeping through the halls. The physicians immediately began treatment, but medicine in the 13th century was limited. Experimental, often ineffective remedies were considered the best options for combating illness. King John was given herbal mixtures and soothing plants to ease his stomach. Warm sitz baths were tried, and some physicians attempted bloodletting to restore the body's supposed balance. Each method offered only brief relief and failed to provide a lasting solution. As afternoon turned to evening, King John was unable to leave his chamber. The abdominal pain had intensified, and diarrhea and vomiting left him utterly exhausted. The physicians stood helplessly at his side, doing everything in their power, yet no remedy provided lasting relief. The king's pride would not allow him to appear helpless in front of anyone. Every movement still bore the weight of a ruler. He issued commands to his advisors, considered the throne's security, and worried for the stability of the kingdom. The palace watched silently. Servants attended to the king with fear and anxiety, acutely aware that a crisis could erupt at any moment. Advisors quietly debated the security of the throne and the future of the realm, calculating potential scenarios. For everyone knew that the king's health was directly tied to the fate of the kingdom. A minor illness could rapidly spiral into a catastrophic crisis. By late evening, King John's condition reached a critical point. It was no longer only stomach pain. Severe diarrhea and continuous vomiting had left him utterly weakened. Every breath echoed with pain. The physicians increased their treatments, moving constantly around the bed in frantic attempts to provide relief. Servants stood quietly nearby, observing his every movement and offering support wherever possible. Throughout this ordeal, the palace was engulfed in tension and fear. The silence that once filled the corridors was now heavy with the echoes of the king's suffering and the anxieties of those within the walls. Advisors whispered to one another, "If the king does not survive the night, what will become of the kingdom?" King John's weakened body and escalating illness cast a shadow of tragedy over the palace. Everyone understood that this was no longer just the suffering of one man. It threatened the future of the entire kingdom. A silent, invisible enemy had claimed the splendor of a powerful king's palace, and history would record how a deadly illness could shake the life of a ruler to its core. King John's illness grew increasingly critical as the days passed. Stomach pain and severe diarrhea overshadowed his once strong and majestic presence, plunging the palace staff and physicians into deep concern. The palace doctors tried every method at their disposal, examining the king's body and attempting to trace the source of his ailment. Yet the limits of 13th century medicine often rendered their efforts insufficient. There were no antibiotics, no modern lab tests, no surgical interventions. Everything relied on observation, trial, and the knowledge passed down through centuries. The chief physician stood at the head of the king's bed, alongside the other doctors. As he wiped the sweat from the king's brow, he spoke quietly. "Your Majesty, please remain calm. We have prepared treatments for you." Weak and exhausted, King John nodded. Yet the pain etched on his face and the trembling of his hands revealed the severity of his condition. The physicians administered herbal mixtures, soothing plants for the stomach, warm sitz baths, and, in some cases, bloodletting. According to contemporary belief, excess bad blood caused illness, and these methods were thought to restore balance. Yet each treatment brought only temporary relief, further taxing the king's frail body. The king's suffering was not only physical, it was slowly consuming him psychologically. His pride forbade him from showing weakness to those around him. Yet with every breath, he felt his body slipping out of his control. The palace watched silently. Servants tended to him with quiet devotion, while advisers whispered among themselves, considering the safety of the throne and the future of the realm. Everyone understood that the king's health was directly linked to the fate of the kingdom. The palace atmosphere grew tense with each passing hour. Quiet footsteps, anxious glances, and low whispers dominated the corridors. Physicians checked the king's pulse, examined his abdomen carefully, and tried to gauge the progression of the illness from every reaction. Servants stood silently at the king's bedside, responding to each shaky movement, yet no effort could halt the disease. King John's eyes would sometimes drift toward the grand walls and historical paintings of the palace, silently enduring his suffering. As the days continued, his condition became even more critical. He could no longer speak, communicating only through labored breaths and the anguish in his eyes. Physicians measured his endurance with every intervention, realizing the inadequacy of herbal remedies and seeking more aggressive approaches. Yet each treatment further exhausted the king, leaving him weaker. Fear and anxiety in the palace intensified with each passing hour. Advisors quietly discussed the temporary governance of the throne and potential crisis scenarios, calculating the unfolding tragedy. For the king's life was not merely a matter of personal health. The death of a ruler directly threatened the security of the realm and the order of his people. By late evening, King John was nearly completely spent. Abdominal pain, vomiting, and diarrhea had drained him physically, and each breath deepened his suffering. Physicians, desperate and helpless, checked his pulse and examined his abdomen, trying to read the course of the illness from every reaction. Servants remained quietly at his side, sharing his pain, yet no word or touch could halt the relentless progression of the disease. The silence of the palace, combined with the king's exhausted body, created a moment where time seemed to stand still. Everyone knew that this illness threatened not only the life of the king, but also the fate of the entire kingdom. History stood ready to record just how helpless even a powerful ruler could be in the face of a simple disease. And at this point, the process that would be remembered in history's dusty pages as a silent and insidious death had begun. King John's struggle had become a critical test for both the palace and the future of the realm. The autumn of 1216 was a turbulent period in England, both in nature and in politics. The stone walls of Newark Castle trapped the howling wind and biting cold outside, while inside, silence, darkness, and fear reigned over the palace. King John's condition had reached a point of no return. Stomach pain and severe diarrhea had confined him to his bed. With each passing hour, his body grew weaker, and his breathing became shaky and irregular. For days, the physicians had done everything within their power. Herbal mixtures, warm sitz baths, abdominal massages, and bloodletting. Each intervention offered only fleeting relief, slightly easing the pain in the king's body, yet the fierce illness had surpassed their knowledge and abilities. As King John turned restlessly in bed, his eyes drifted to the palace's magnificent walls and historical paintings, silently recalling his past victories and losses. His pride would not allow him to appear helpless before anyone. Though his body had lost control, his mind remained strong and determined. Servants stood quietly by his bedside, concealing the fear in their eyes, observing every breath and trembling movement. Advisors whispered softly among themselves, discussing temporary governance of the throne and calculating the potential chaos that could erupt at any moment. As the hours passed, the king's breaths grew weaker. His eyes were half closed, hands trembling, face pale and slick with sweat. Physicians measured his pulse meticulously, pressed gently on his abdomen, and tried to understand every response. Servants stood silently by, attempting to share his pain, but no words or touch could halt the disease. The palace was so quiet that even a distant creaking door or a step echoing from the corridors was immediately noticed. And then the moment came. On October 19th, 1216, the light of King John's powerful reign was extinguished, silent, insidious, and complete. Death had crept in, claiming his exhausted body entirely. An immediate hush fell over the palace. Only the distant echo of footsteps and the trembling breaths of physicians could be heard. The king's death marked the end of an era, affecting not just one man, but the fate of an entire kingdom. The palace staff were left in profound sorrow and fear at the certainty of death. Servants tried to hide their tears. Some prayed quietly, and others could not leave the king's chamber, standing broken and helpless. Advisors hastily devised plans for the temporary governance of the throne, attempting to prevent chaos. Physicians washed their hands and cast a final glance at the king's lifeless body, each knowing that this tragic death would be indelibly recorded in history. King John's death was documented by historians as a death from severe diarrhea. This event highlighted not only his physical vulnerability, but also the limitations of medieval medicine and the critical importance of hygiene and health conditions. Even a ruler, one of the most powerful and feared leaders of his time, could be rendered helpless by a simple illness. While silence enveloped the palace, the kingdom outside waited in turmoil and uncertainty. Questions of succession and how to maintain the realm's stability came to the forefront. History was ready to record the lessons learned from this death and how the kingdom would be shaped by this tragedy. And so the magnificent palace of a powerful king fell into silence. History would forever bear witness to how helpless even a ruler could be in the face of death, the formidable power of disease, and the fragility of human life. After King John's death, Newark Castle was shrouded in silence. The palace staff were still reeling from the tragedy. Yet the affairs of the kingdom did not pause. John's death sent shockwaves far beyond the palace walls, affecting all of England. When the people learned of the king's passing, they were struck with fear and astonishment. The vacancy on the throne created political uncertainty across the realm. John's death directly impacted the future of his young son, Henry III, and the stability of the kingdom. Only 8 years old, Henry had officially ascended the throne, but the governance of the country was temporarily entrusted to experienced advisors and lords. This situation presented both opportunities and dangers. Foreign enemies and internal dissenters began to wait for a weak rule, seeking to expand their influence during this vulnerable period. Historians interpreted King John's death not merely as a biological event, but as a turning point with serious consequences for the politics and governance of medieval England. His death from diarrhea highlighted the limitations of contemporary medical knowledge and underscored the critical importance of hygiene. The lack of health precautions in both palace and city life endangered not just the king, but the population at large. King John's legacy entered the historical record as a controversial one. The tax crises, popular uprisings, and political disputes of his reign were extensively studied after his death. Yet the cause of his death became both a tragic and instructive example in history books, a reminder of how power and splendor could be rendered fragile in the face of the human body and the forces of nature. The palace staff and advisors worked to secure the young King Henry III's rule. After John's death, England had to carefully navigate both internal and external threats, maintaining a delicate balance of power. Everyone understood that even a simple illness could wield enough influence to alter the destiny of an entire kingdom. Thus, history remembered John both as a powerful ruler and as a human being. The legacy left by his death extended beyond politics and society. It served as an important lesson in health, hygiene, and medicine. Future generations regarded King John's death as a case that reminded them of the fragility of history and the delicate nature of human life. The death of King John serves as a significant example in history, demonstrating the devastating impact health crises could have on royal families, not only in England but across Europe. In the Middle Ages, limitations in hygiene and medical knowledge could not protect even members of royalty from fatal illnesses. Despite lavish feasts and the presence of the most skilled physicians in palaces, a simple infection or digestive disorder could alter the fate of rulers and reshape entire states. Consider the example of Louis VIII of France. During the Crusade of 1270, the king suffered from severe diarrhea and abdominal ailments. His death in the midst of the campaign not only disrupted France's strategic plans, but also triggered a shift in the political balance across Europe. The monarch's passing shook the organization of the royal family and the state, leaving uncertainty and a power vacuum in its wake. Similar events occurred in England as well. During the reign of Edward I, members of the royal family succumbed to various digestive and intestinal disorders, creating gaps in leadership and sparking struggles for power. Even within the palace, where the finest foods and the most experienced physicians were available, the limited medical knowledge of the era proved insufficient to prevent these illnesses. Some kingdoms in Italy and Germany were also affected by such tragedies. Diseases not only threatened individual lives, but also disrupted political stability. The deaths of royal members accelerated the actions of both internal and external powers, fueled court intrigues, and intensified succession disputes. Historians have treated these cases not merely as dramatic events, but also as instructive examples, highlighting the need for advancements in health and medicine within society. The death of King John, along with similar incidents, underscores how vulnerable even a powerful ruler could be in the face of a simple illness. These deaths allowed historians to analyze the effects of inadequate medical knowledge, poor hygiene, and limited healthcare during the Middle Ages. Palaces and castles, while outwardly symbols of wealth and power, revealed their fragility when confronted with disease. In this context, King John's legacy is multifaceted. Though remembered politically as a controversial ruler, the cause and circumstances of his death provide an unforgettable lesson for historians. Even a seemingly minor digestive disorder could profoundly influence the fate of a kingdom. History not only recounts events, but also imparts important insights into health, hygiene, and human vulnerability. Thus, the death of King John is etched into European royal history as a tragic yet instructive example. It represents not just an individual tragedy, but also a symbol of the political, societal, and medical limitations of the era. Palaces and castles could not always protect even the most powerful rulers. Disease, regardless of human efforts to control time and circumstances, could strike unexpectedly and alter the course of life. The death of King John has gone down in history as both a dramatic and instructive event for historians and health experts alike. It demonstrated how vulnerable even a powerful ruler could be in the face of a simple illness, despite the grandeur of palaces and the presence of experienced physicians. This tragic event was not merely an individual death, it became a striking example of how the fate of a kingdom, a society, and historical processes could be profoundly affected. One of the most fundamental lessons from John's death lies in the limitations of medieval medicine. At a time when even a simple case of diarrhea could be fatal, physicians were powerless. Herbal mixtures, warm sitz baths, and bloodletting were inadequate to halt the progression of illness. Even with the finest doctors and the most expensive treatments within the palace, deficiencies in healthcare and hygiene left even the strongest rulers unprotected. For historians and modern medical scholars, this provides a critical perspective on how harsh life in the Middle Ages truly was. Another lesson is that power and splendor are no match for human vulnerability. King John may have been formidable in political maneuvering, capable of instilling fear in his enemies, and experienced in governing his realm, yet a simple illness ended his life. This demonstrates that throughout history, even the most powerful leaders could be rendered defenseless against the forces of nature and health crises. The effects of John's death on the kingdom were also profound. His 8-year-old son, Henry III, ascended the throne, creating gaps in governance and political uncertainty. Advisors and lords temporarily assumed control of the country, while carefully monitoring the movements of internal and external forces. This clearly illustrates that the death of a monarch was not just a personal tragedy, but an event capable of shaping the fate of an entire kingdom. Furthermore, King John's death offered lessons in medicine, hygiene, and public health. Historians have used this case to examine why hygiene and healthcare in medieval societies developed slowly, and why epidemics and illnesses could be so devastating. Even members of the royal family, without access to modern treatments, were not immune to death, highlighting the limitations of medieval medical knowledge. In conclusion, King John's death was not merely the tragedy of an individual. It symbolized the political, societal, and medical challenges of an era. History reminds us through this event of both the fragility of human life and the limits of power and splendor. The fact that a simple illness could alter the destiny of a kingdom offers lessons for the future. Health, hygiene, and awareness are of vital importance and must never be neglected. This historical event endures as an unforgettable example, both for understanding the past and drawing lessons for the future.